Hello everyone, and welcome to the final instalment in our IT/OT safety webinar series. Over the course of the series, we've been discussing the topic of OT security and the challenge of IT/OT convergence in industrial settings. So businesses are clearly harnessing the benefit of the huge and obvious upsides of convergence of IT and OT to get data off for real-time inventory management in manufacturing or predictive maintenance in other industries. But with the upside comes a potential downside, and the business change shouldn't introduce any unnecessary cyber risks that can ultimately impact safety. We've also discussed how to drive successful cultural change and tackling the need for cyber professionals to engage with engineering and safety communities within their business to deliver successful OT security programs. So the series has covered the OT security journey, as is depicted on the slide today. And in webinar 1, we were talking really about the baseline and the diagnostic. So when you go out and you start to understand what potential cyber risks and your security posture within your industrial facilities and environments. And then the second installment was focused, of course, on control implementation. So once you've understood what your risks are, what your threats and vulnerabilities are within your facility, you start to implement those security controls and define the architecture that you're going to implement. Both of those are available on demand if you missed them, so please go ahead and watch those on demand. So just before we start, there's going to be a poll, a number of polls today. So please have a look at that. Where are you on your OT security journey? Have you not started? Are you baselining? Are you operationalizing? Or are you into optimization, which is the theme of today? So just a quick introduction to myself. My name's Sean Arrowsmith. I'm Director of Industrials at NCC Group. So as the name suggests, I look after the industrial sectors across energy, across utilities, water, manufacturing and transportation. I'll just give you a quick overview of NCC Group as well. So NCC is a global services business. We're focused almost entirely on cybersecurity and operational resilience. We are 2,500 people worldwide, and we're operating across Asia Pacific, headquartered out of the UK and into Europe, and we also work in North America. Broadly, we are working in 4 distinct pillars: technical assurance, where we are going in and understanding technical issues within our customers' environments, doing security architecture consulting, but also penetration testing, security testing, everything from cloud infrastructures to hardware-based systems and even industrial control systems. We then have risk management and governance, where we're covering the regulatory drivers for our customers and helping them navigate those quite tricky environments requirements that they have to comply with, everything from NIS2 to the Cyber Resilience Act in the UK market, the NCSC's cyber assessment framework to support NIS2 compliance. We also have a managed service business, so we're monitoring our customers' networks 24/7, 365, looking for indicators of compromise and trying to catch the bad people before they do anything serious. And then finally, when things do go wrong, and sadly they do, we have a digital forensics and incident response capability as well. So we're often in helping organizations elegantly manage an incident and minimize business interruption and the impact of that breach. We also have our Escode business, which does software escrow for operational resilience in terms of software code that they look after on behalf of customers as well. Within the industrial markets, we're supporting large-scale programs and transformation programs within OT, as depicted on the journey that we have there. It starts with our facility due diligence, where we're often looking at discrete facilities and understanding risks within them, doing threat and vulnerability assessment, looking at asset inventory, architecture, incident response, regulatory requirements, etc. And we also uniquely have a safety division that supports that service as well. Anyway, that's enough about myself and NCC. We'll start to move into the session today. As I mentioned, the session is about optimization and maturing OT risk reduction and OT cyber security within operational environments, having already been through that diagnostic deployment of controls and then moving into that continuous improvement, because this thing is a continuous challenge to us in the industry. I'm really delighted today to introduce our panel. So we have Ali Dyer, who is the CISO from Associated British Foods, Floris Dankart, who's a product manager in our managed services division, and Phil Tonkin, who is Field Chief Technology Officer at one of our global partnerships, Dragos. So welcome everyone. I thought we'd start just if you could all do a brief introduction to yourselves. So I'll start with you, Ali, if you want to give the audience an introduction.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sean. Yes, so Ali Dyer. I'm 7 months into my role at Associated British Foods as the Group CISO. For those that haven't heard of Associated British Foods, which was me before I started here, it's a very large organisation, 138,000 employees operating in about 53 countries. And it's actually a group of 81 individual businesses split into 5 areas. So that's retail, sugar, ingredients, agriculture and grocery. And even though you might not have heard of Associated British Foods, you would have heard of some of our brands. So Silver Spoon, Twinings, Kingsmill, Patak's, Blue Dragon, to name but a few of the brands that we have. And in the retail space, we actually own Primark. So a large variety of companies under that umbrella of Associated British Foods. This is my 3rd CISO role. Prior to this, I was the CISO at ASOS, the online fashion company. And before that, I was the CISO at Urenco, which is the uranium enrichment company. And I got into cyber while I was working for GlaxoSmithKline for 16 years. And I ran their global cyber program for 6 years as well. I'm actually a mechanical engineer by background. And I love the OT space. It's the area I'm most passionate about when we get into cybersecurity. Outside of the job, I sit on the National Cyber Advisory Board with the Cabinet Office. That was created 2 years ago to bring representation into the forming of national strategies around cyber. So that's me, Sean.
Brilliant. Good to have you on today, Ali. Over to you, Phil.
Hi, I'm Phil Tonkin from Dragos. I'm the field CTO, and my role is looking at how we can use our technologies and our services to advance the needs of our customers. In particular, I focus on the energy sector. I spent 23 years in the electricity business before, finding my own way from engineering into cybersecurity, and I came into that by looking at the risks and the requirements of resilience for the electricity sector, and realized that one of the big emerging trends was the need to look at that operational technology security, and building on an understanding of what makes those businesses operate. I brought a new lens to that from a cyber perspective. And so, I joined Dragos 3 years ago, and I've done a variety of roles here, but now very much working hands-on with our customers and our partners to advance that journey. And very glad to be able to advise CISOs and electric companies and oil and gas companies around the world in understanding what the best way is to implement strategies in the OT space.
Brilliant, thanks, Phil. And Floris?
Yes, Floris Dankart. I'm a product manager at our managed services division at NCC Group, at Fox IT, which is the Dutch subsidiary for NCC Group. And as a product manager for our managed services division, I've seen a development over the past couple of years where in RFPs that are traditionally more focused towards the IT side of things, because that's our traditional core business, we're seeing a lot more demand for OT going forward. So that's got us starting along a long journey of professionalizing an OT managed services proposition. And although NCC Group has been servicing industrial clients, manufacturing clients, energy sector clients for a long time, the proper managed service response to that is not necessarily obvious. So that's been a journey, and something that has really piqued my interest. So we're building that out. And from my professional background, it's also quite interesting because I'm also an IT auditor by training. And there's certainly a compliance angle to this.
Brilliant. Welcome, Floris, and welcome to the panel. Just going back onto housekeeping, the other thing I should mention is we do encourage questions. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the question facility. So do please enter some questions into there for the panel, and we'll pick them up as we go through the session. we got some results back from the first poll, actually, saying that along the journey that we got about half operationalizing, so actually into the process of deploying security controls into their operational technology environments. About 28% are baselining, so they're doing that initial diagnostics, and then 20% haven't started, and 8% are actually into this kind of maturity curve of continuous improvement and optimization of the control environment to make sure that they maintain that security posture. Okay, so we'll move now into the first question. So the first question that we are going to pose to the panel is, what are the key principles that guide the creation and maintenance of a robust security posture within an OT environment? So I'm going to go to Ali first with that question.
Fantastic. I think this is a difficult one because it's kind of, well, where do I start? Because there are so many. I think I'm just going to start in general because I always view cyber as a whole as a big transformation program. You are trying to get the business from where they are now to somewhere they need to be. And in the IT space, we really think about all of the elements of a cyber program, from education and awareness to infrastructure changes to access control. And, you know, it's this broad program. And then you get to OT, and people think of it as just another work stream under that program, but it's not. It's kind of, to do OT, you've got to do the whole of the rest of the program all over again in the OT space. So I think that's just one principle, is don't underestimate the OT space. It is just as broad and complex as the whole of the rest of the IT change program. I think some of the key principles, though, when I think about OT security, it has to start with understanding your network segmentation. If you're going to have a ransomware attack, we know that ransomware attacks in the past year have increased to 10% to 17% of all attacks. And those 17% are the ones impacting manufacturing. But all of those 17% are still occurring on the IT side and spreading into OT. They're not directly targeting OT in general. So segmentation, or keeping your IT segregated from the OT to stop that blast radius of any attack from IT spreading into OT, is my number one protective control to protect my OT environment. I think it's also about roles and responsibilities between IT and OT. You do your segmentation, you've got your IT side, you're following your Purdue model, you've got your DMZ in the middle. But what are those roles and responsibilities in terms of what IT do versus what your OT people do, your process engineers? Where do those accountabilities sit? How does that fit with the culture of your organization? Do you have a huge number of process control engineers who can manage the firewalls themselves? Or actually, are you skill poor on the OT side in terms of you don't have the skills to manage the firewall rules, and therefore that skill set needs to sit with IT? There is no hard and fast way of doing this. This is about matching your control set to the culture and skill set within your organization. So just coming back to that holistic approach, those key principles are not just about the segmentation and the infrastructure. You have to think about incident management. When something happens, who does what? How do people become aware? How do you get the help in? How do you trigger your retainers that you've got in place? How are your suppliers on the OT side going to access remotely, given you don't want them coming onto site every day, because that's a very expensive cost model? What about access management? And what about vulnerability management and patching? So think of it in the broad terms and make sure that you don't just focus on one aspect of control, because then you're going to leave a hole in another. So I've opened it with those thoughts, now on to others.
That's really, really useful. Thanks, Ali. And we talked about in previous sessions about that kind of cultural match between the requirements and the controls that you're deploying and who can do those, and actually kind of winning the hearts and minds of the engineering facility as well within the business. So I'm going to go next to Floris. What's your take, please?
Yes, I think I want to pick it up at a word that Ali mentioned. It started off with making sure you have a holistic approach in place. And for me, that also means a good connection between your IT and your OT side of things. One of the key principles there would be that you have a cross-functional team. So while we do recognize that there are different disciplines, different expertise groups for OT and IT, because you would have different systems and maybe a different security culture in place, it's really important that those enrich each other and not just work alongside each other. And when you do things like making sure you have an asset inventory, making sure that you have your vulnerabilities managed, making sure that you maybe have network monitoring and alerting in place further down the line. You also always want to do that with a view of overseeing the entire flow from IT to OT, because that's what threat actors do as well. They tend to start looking for an in, and that in might be through IT and then approach down to OT, or they can start an OT segment, or maybe with the IT in OT. So you should do the same as a defender. You should really look at the whole picture, and I think that's nicely in line with what Ali said as well.
Yeah, yeah, thanks, Aris. And Phil, yeah, good to get your take with your vast energy experience and everything you've been doing with Dragos of late. So
yeah, the best place I think to start from this is when I think about the strategies that people need to implement is they need to understand the legislative environment in which they operate. It's really important that people know what they have to do for compliance. But before you get to that point, which is nearly always a journey, it's really important to look at it from the perspective of what is the threat. And the threat to each different industry and each different business unit is different depending on how they're exposed, what their operations are, where they operate in the world, and who might be targeting them. And as Ali already mentioned, there's been a huge increase in the amount of ransomware that is targeting specifically industrial operations. And we each year publish some results on our measurements of the number of industries that are impacted, how they're impacted, and we see that in particular manufacturing sectors in an 87% increase in the number of service impacting ransomware events. And it isn't just the number of events, it's also the number of groups targeting. So you look at it from the perspective of the individual ransomware groups targeting ICS and causing an impact. We've seen a 60% increase in the number of groups doing that. And so there's a wider variety of people looking to exploit the inner weaknesses of operational technology because they know that there's a motivated end user of those assets that puts a great deal of value in those systems. They know that it's the operation of the business that generates its revenue. So when you're coming up with a strategy to try and manage that threat, it's really, really important to understand what the threats are. And so then you can layer on some relatively basic controls. And we often will advocate for the SANS 5 critical controls in operational technology. It's so tempting to look at the IC frameworks or the NIST frameworks and try and implement everything from it. There's some really fundamental things that won't happen in IT that are very basic. They're missing from OT, but they're quite basic in the IT world. And we can sometimes rush to doing those things. We want to patch everything. We want to make sure everybody has individualized user access accounts. But actually, when you look at the threats and how they manifest, having a good, robust architecture and a defensive, posture around the systems can help, making sure that the only way in and out is a secure one, having a good visibility of those assets within that protective perimeter. That's absolutely vital. So you know what it is you're protecting, and you can see the manifestation of any threat. You're using that information to come up with not just a vulnerability management approach, but a risk-based vulnerability management approach. You can get to the point where only 4 to 5% of the vulnerabilities really need to be addressed if you know what the threats are to the system and how you're architected. And it suddenly becomes achievable. OT patch management is a very, very difficult task. It's hugely complicated. And so if you can get to the point where you only need to implement a small number of those, it can have a really, really big impact. But before you get to any of those practical measures, you've got to be prepared for the worst case. And so, having in place incident response retainers, having on board a team of responders who can come in and support you through incidents in IT and OT, that's where great partnerships coming between organizations to help support companies through their darkest hour when should any of those controls fail or should they not yet be implemented, because it is a journey. Every industrial organization is addressing this challenge from a position of retrospect and is pushing ahead of the adversaries, but it is a continuous journey that we're all on, and so we have to make sure that we're prepared just in case there's something goes wrong during that journey.
Yeah, really interesting. I think you sort of echoed a bit of the other panelists' points there, and Ali talking about the fact that within an IT program, actually the same principles might apply within OT, albeit that the technology is different, the operating environment's different. And I guess the ransomware focus into manufacturing, if you stop a manufacturer manufacturing stuff, that costs them money. So, you know, they're more likely to pay a ransom, therefore they're an enticing target to focus on. And then, yeah, the SANS 5 critical controls is a really good set of controls to look at. Getting the basics right, you know, even within IT security environments, I think still is still challenging. So yeah, get that baseline and the basics right, I think is absolutely right. So we're talking to, I mean, obviously today the topic is about that kind of continuous and optimization of controls and maintaining that that control environment within your operational facilities and whatever environments that you're operating. The second question is really focused around, we've touched on the fact that often you've got process engineers involved and various others within these sites. And you know, what we see, I think, when we go into some of these facilities is that engineers like to make things work better, and then might have a habit of tinkering occasionally and sort of adding in things to the environment that perhaps you wouldn't want to have in there, because they can expand the attack surface and introduce new threats. So the second question really is about how do you control change and maintain a cohesive safety and security culture? So when you're doing your initial deployment of controls and you're building that awareness amongst those engineering communities, how do you maintain that and stay on top of it? We do have another poll at this stage to the audience on this question, which is, has your OT security controlled environment degraded over time? So if you've gone into the operationalization stage and you're into controlled improvement, etc., have you seen it degrade over time for people introducing new things? But so go back to the question about how do you maintain that culture and that security. I'll start with Floris, please. Thanks.
Yes, thanks. This can obviously be challenging because you would have engineers and other people on the floor that are constantly tinkering, making adjustments to make the operation run smoothly. And then the key is to make sure that you have a change control process in place, and that is also frequently practiced and tested, and not just through a security lens, but also through a safety lens. So what you can really then do is try and reframe those safety requirements as cybersecurity requirements. You would then align your safety and security goals and make sure that you have the right prioritization between them. So that all comes down to what we basically talked around already, is making sure that you have a comprehensive, holistic risk management approach for IT as well as for OT, but in this case, more focused towards OT. And there you should also look at OT and IT convergence and how that creates new risks and how you're basically poking holes in your segmentation. Sometimes.
Well, I think Floris has experienced some network issues there. Phil, can I pass the question to you? Just to
absolutely. Oh, Floris is back.
He's back. Floris, we lost you for a moment there.
I think I noticed. I'm not sure what the last piece was you got, but I was talking about the making sure that you have a comprehensive risk management strategy. Yeah. That's important. So that means consistently assessing and mitigating your risks in OT as well as in IT, as well as in that converging space. And there's definitely a converging space because you want to do monitoring of OT through IT. You also want to do maintenance. You might want to patch things remotely. And from a security perspective, you might want to have things like network monitoring in place or endpoint monitoring, even in an OT space. And then there's always a balance between creating new holes in your segmentation, new ways to go out and in of your OT environment, which is okay, but always as part of a proper.
Okay, I think with Floris, we'll move on to Phil now, if that's okay. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that really sort of has often surprised me about this type of question is that perception around where is the change control in OT. When viewed from within an IT security lens, the typical change management processes and rigor. That's his audio is just catching up. The typical sort of rigor processes around change management can be can appear to be absent from within the OT space. And when I first started to look at this, I was looking at it very specifically with the lens of an electricity transmission operator. I thought, well, where's the problem? Change control is actually really quite robust from the point of view of ensuring that the change is made appropriately. So when a commissioning engineer makes any kind of change to a protection or control system in the high voltage electricity sector, it's done with a great deal of rigor. Everything from taking the settings and hashing them, making sure that the ones that you're applying are the ones that have been verified and tested, and because it's a very, very safety first culture, and also there isn't a need for a lot of operational change. Once the thing is tested to the extreme it's implemented, unless something goes wrong or you're making a physical change to the network, you don't need to keep reconfiguring those systems. So we have all these processes in place, but when you start to think about it from the point of view of of a threat actor, you realize that the change control that's there doesn't actually address the threat that might manifest in this space. If an engineer decides that they are going to maliciously modify something, that isn't detectable. So just having a good, robust change for people following the process is good, but people can nefariously go ahead and do things without really having any kind of monitoring, because you can't see or visualize that the change is taking place if you're not looking at that network. Similarly, people can be very aware of policies and change requirements, but they are trying to get a job done. The need to monitor something during commissioning, the ad hoc addition of things like remote access is still very common by engineers trying to solve a problem. And so, whilst the settings and controls around safety systems can be very robust, it's the ad hoc additions to things that often really introduce risks in this space. And it came as a huge surprise to me when I started to look at all the sectors, and I started to move away from just looking at electricity, and I went into the gas world and realized that in large mechanical systems with rotational plant, that you have to keep modifying the process parameters. Things age, they wear, they change. You're tweaking timings and settings on devices, and so to see somebody actively in a SCADA system reconfiguring it, during live operations was completely unheard of. When I'm coming from a world where to make the slightest change, you take an outage, you apply something that's rigorously tested, and then apply it and test it again and test it again, and then negatively test it to make sure. Commissioning is very different in different environments, and you're in always on process industries. The need to change is there and is vital, and so that's something we have to really consider: is what is the problem that they're trying to solve for, rather than just implementing a process on top of it. And I spend a lot of time trying to work out what are the variables and the deviations from policy that engineers make, not nefariously, but in their ability to try and do their job. What is it that we put in place, and from a policy point of view, as OT security leaders and thought leaders, what are we suggesting that they keep going around or diverting because it's not practical for them? Whether it's them using their own laptop because the corporate one doesn't work for them. Well, how do we make the corporate one actually solve their problem? Rather than, you have to allow them to continue. We want to keep the operations going, but how do we capture their needs and use cases and provide them with security tools that actually make their job easier? If we keep telling them, no, you can't have remote access, then they're going to find a way of doing it via shadow means. But give them good remote access, and then they'll use it, and they'll use the right way. Give them patterns to use for those new innovations, the new connectivity requirements for condition monitoring that they might have. It's about making the delivery of new innovative solutions secure from the start, and security teams being there. And I think that's the cultural shift. It's not just about how do we get them to do it the way that we used to do it, in IT, and we know works for IT, but actually how do we go about understanding their particular needs and solving a problem for them to take them on that cultural journey.
That's really interesting. It's interesting that actually throughout this series, it's come a lot of the conversations come back to that cultural piece and the awareness element, and giving engineers the right tools to do the job within their environment, so that they don't look for those workarounds and things is really important, isn't it? So that's interesting that you've raised that as well. And Ali, it'd be good to hear from you in terms of your experience.
Yes, I think I'm just pretty much going to build on what Phil said, because I completely agree with the points he's raised. I've always thought it's really interesting between IT and OT, the differences in perception of risk, because if you're dealing with someone generally in the IT space who is maybe a help desk support person or someone supporting infrastructure, they're always one step removed from the actual business impact. So it's actually, in a way, harder to get an IT person to understand the impact of something going down. You don't have that in the OT space. If you've met a process control engineer or someone in a plant, you have no problem at all getting them to understand the perception of risk, of what a cyber attack could cause, because they know that's going to cause their line to go down, which is what their whole being is to stop that happening, to get that overall equipment effectiveness and to keep that plant operational as long as possible. So this is a real positive for us in terms of that, how you control change in that environment, because if you can train your engineers to really understand the cyber risk, they will grasp that incredibly fast and understand then that if they change the environment, that could open the door for a cyber person coming in, which is actually introducing risk, which could bring the plant down. So one of the biggest tools I've always used in this space is education. Bring your engineers along on the journey, explain the cyber risk, explain those TTPs and the attack paths into the plant, and very soon they will actually create their own processes to stop that happening. So education for me is absolutely number one in this space. I think the last point I'll just raise though is a risk that I've come across, which I find incredibly hard to manage in the OT space, and that is where it's the evolution of supposed like-for-like kit. So I used to work in nuclear. This was again a very controlled environment that Phil described. So, but say you take a piece of kit that's been in the plant for 10 years and it starts to break and we don't have any spares. They will go out and they'll try and source a like-for-like replacement for that piece of kit. But it's moved on in several generations and you don't know what technology is now in that identical piece of kit that wasn't there before. So, is the same bit of kit that used to be a completely isolated standalone kit, does that now have a 5G card inside it for communications, which helps with Industry 4.0? So that's a really difficult area. So change control of the actual kit itself and understanding what functionality is in that kit is a particularly difficult area in OT, and one that you have to work very collaboratively with your OT engineers to make sure that they are understanding that even though it looks the same on the outside, it may be very different on the inside.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and that kind of language and winning the hearts and minds of the engineering communities is vital. But it keeps coming back to that cultural training piece, and you can't go in with the kind of CIA message, confidentiality and integrity, availability. It's got to be safety, availability, and integrity, and then confidentiality. Even if you touch on that in some of these environments, so I guess it's speaking that language and really something that's going to resonate with the engineers. I don't know whether Phil, in the energy markets, you saw any other areas where lack of awareness was introducing risk, because we hear about physical controls leaving doors open because the air conditioning isn't working or something, just because it's getting hot and things. And
yeah, I mean, it's thinking about the natural human nature when securing things. I've been in many secure facilities where the more secure you want to make it, the more extreme the physical controls get. And the best example was when I was walking around a location once where there were very, very heavy steel doors, and they propped it open, and there was this continuous buzzing that they were effectively blind to. They couldn't hear it anymore and even the operations center, well, yeah, they leave that door open, and you think, well, actually, what is the human edge? When you're thinking about physical security for the protection of a cyber asset, you're actually looking for something that gives you auditability of it, because the actor could be an inside actor. They're unlikely to smash down the door to do it. You just want to know who's been through that door. And so you would, actually a lightweight wooden door with a simple card access system is a more robust control because it's more likely to be used. A heavy steel door with a card and a pin and an emergency pin to enter if you're under duress might seem like the greater and more robust control, but it's the one that's more likely to just be circumvented because it's impractical for people. And it was somebody once described to me that if you want to keep a secret safe, you don't put it in a big metal safe, because somebody could come along, open it, read your secret, and put it back. If you want to keep something a secret safe, put it inside of a wet paper bag, because that's once that then your secret is compromised. And that's really it's that kind of logic that you need to apply when thinking about these environments. We're not necessarily protecting the confidentiality of something. We want to make sure it's robust and its uptime is there, or its safety integrity is there. So you've got to think about what is the most appropriate control and what is the most practical control for people. Another great example was walking around a site doing an assessment and seeing that somebody had brought an Ethernet port to the front of a locked cabinet. And the person guiding me saw it and said, you're going to comment on that? You're going to say that's a bad idea? I said, no, because now I know where they're going to plug in. If you lock every port down on every switch in the OT environment and you put those ports in a separate locked cabinet, the first thing they're going to do is just pull the Ethernet cable out of a PLC somewhere and plug it into their laptop, therefore circumventing any access control lists you might have, or any, all the lockdown ports become, neutralized. But if you make one port available for them to plug into, you can monitor that port. And so it's not about prevention. Sometimes, so it is about monitoring, because the engineer will find a way around your blocking. And will find an innovative way which then circumvents the controls. Or actually, if you provide them an easy way of accessing it, they become more monitorable, and therefore you're enabling them to do their job at the same time as having visibility of the actions they're taking, whether nefarious, accidentally against policy, or just doing their job in the correct way, which is still a good thing to observe.
Yeah, it's coming back to that kind of pragmatism, isn't it, and appropriate and proportionate controls that don't put too much of a barrier in place that people just want to get around it. So it's got to be an enabler. Good. Okay. So we'll move on to our third question. So what are the key components to maintaining visibility of the threat landscape and your defensive security posture? I'm actually I'll start with Ali on this one. Just encourage everyone also, just before we go into the question, to add any questions yourself into the Q&A section of the platform on the right hand side. And also we've got our final poll happening now, which is, have you successfully deployed real-time monitoring in your OT environment? So Ali, over to you on this question.
Yeah, so I'm going to come at this one from a slightly odd angle and not answer the question directly to begin with. But in terms of maintaining that visibility of the threat landscape and maintaining that defensive security posture, we've talked about a lot of the controls that you have to put in place. But on this one, I'm actually going to start with knowing your business. The key components for me are very different depending on the type of site that you're trying to protect. I have 200 manufacturing sites in Associated British Foods, and they are not all created equal. And there is no one size fits all for me in terms of the answer to what are those key components. If you've got a critical site that is absolutely delivering huge amounts of revenue to you, it needs to be up 100% of the time, you have downstream dependencies, you might even have life dependencies depending on some of the products you're manufacturing, then that might be one that you need to put all the bells and whistles in. You need your full protective controls, you need your full detective controls, you need to have visibility of every asset that's in there, you want to know exactly when something changes so that you can have a very quick response time. But that only works if that site has the margin to actually justify the investment in those tools. These are businesses after all, and you have to right size your defenses to the contribution of those sites to your company. So I'm taking very much a tiered approach here in this space, and I have sort of maybe 3 different models that I will deploy: a tier A site, a tier B, a tier C site. An A might be all singing, all dancing OT controls, but my tier C site might be, well, actually, I'm just going to put in place a really good perimeter and have very good backup and practice restore capabilities, because that might actually be the most cost-effective components for that model and for its contribution to the business, and also match the margins that factory operates under. So that's kind of kicked off the conversation with the know your business perspective, understand the environment in there, what their contribution is, and make sure that you get the right model that fits your business proposition.
Yeah, that's really useful. I'd say taking a risk-based approach to, proportionate control implementation, because there's no point in putting the same level of security into every site. Yeah, absolutely get that. That's a really important point. Floris, what were your thoughts on this, please?
Yes, it was really an interesting point that Ellie made. That of course you want your security posture to fit your business, and there it makes a lot of sense to have a tiered approach. What that immediately triggers in my mind is then, okay, then you have different businesses in isolation almost that have a different security posture. How does the communication between those work then? How does that relate back to your monitoring tools and your office administration? And then the main word that comes up is network. And in OT, as well as between OT and IT, as well as between different sites, there is a network in some way, shape, or form. And whereas in IT we typically have a combination of things to monitor your security posture, including a SIEM, EDR tooling, and network detection and response, you don't typically start with that network in IT. And in OT, I think it is key for a couple of reasons. Because the network can be monitored passively most of the time, and that really helps out with the paradigm in OT where you don't want any interference. You don't want. I was talking to an engineer earlier today, and he mentioned that maybe 10 years ago, in one of his first OT type network sensor deployments, they installed a network sensor in a factory segment, and it was configured behind a switch, an old, somewhat defective switch. And this configuration caused a ever so slight delay in the events, and upstream in the factory that caused a disturbance, and the PLCs got out of sync, and eventually there was an error in the production line. Now that type of thing is something that might be to an extent acceptable in IT. In OT, definitely is not. So you want to really make sure that monitoring that you're doing on the network is as indisruptive, if that's a word, that it doesn't create any sort of disruption. And for that reason, when we apply a network monitoring tool, we always make sure that there is a mirror that you're monitoring through a span port or a tap. And I think that's exactly the way that they do it in over at Dragos as well. So yeah. I feel like I'm sort of deviating from the question here, but I think the network really is key to monitor your own security posture. And of course, there's also the whole conversation, if you are looking at a more straight answer, around making sure that you have an awareness of first your business, and then subsequently the threats to that business, what the threat actors are you should be concerned about, what those threat actors are doing, and how they could potentially affect you, what their TTPs are, and that then informs your security posture as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Floris. And Phil, I'm sure you've got plenty to say about this piece in particular. So
yeah, I mean, firstly, it's understanding what that threat landscape looks like. You need to understand what the threats are, and not just so that you decide whether you should or shouldn't do it, but also to understand how actors behave, how they operate, and therefore where are the effective places to put network controls. So we still observe that a majority of threats that manifest in all OT environments are coming via external network connections. They're still coming in via IT, via complex demilitarized zones and segmentation. Those controls are fallible, and they can be compromised. So concentrating the monitoring capabilities and is vital to know where is best to place them and what the right kind of visibility is. I mean, the engineer in me wants to desperately monitor every tiny variant within every network. But do you really need to monitor things like process variables? We're talking about threats here, and threats that have got to be significant scale. There's an economy of scale, even for the attacker. So we need to be looking at where the greatest impact can be. And it might sound strange coming from a company that sells the capability of monitoring networks, that actually we often will coach all of our customers to look at implementing in the places that will give them the greatest impact in terms of managing the real threats and risks that face them. If you've got hundreds of small remote sites with a single RTU on them, hardening those sites is much, much more robust, and monitoring the central communications to them than trying to implement a sensor at every single location. It's just not cost effective. It's much better to have, as I was saying, you understand the assets there, harden them, and have a recovery mechanism, should something go wrong at those smaller locations. But so it's identifying your crown jewels, working out and understand how might threat actors manifest within this space, and then put in place the appropriate controls and validate those controls. If as well as I'd like to encourage everybody to rush out and put lots and lots of Dragos platform everywhere. It's before you get to there, most organizations really need to think about that defensive posture. Look at the firewalls that you have in place. Are they effectively configured? Can you take those configurations and map those out? And understand exactly how those defensive systems are implemented and how the risks may manifest through them, because that will help with understanding where else do you need to implement visibility, intrusion detection. But even just to get that visibility of what are those assets. The most successful implementations of any tools come from organizations that have already got a good understanding of what's there. They know what they've built. We a lot of customers come to me and say, I want to put the platform in because I don't know what I've got. It's actually very difficult to get really, really good value out of any tool, from any supplier, without having a good understanding of physically what the network looks like and which OEMs you work with and what protocols might be there. You then use the tools to discover the unknowns. But starting from so get out there, understand the sites, risk assess the sites, prioritize the sites, and then bring the technologies in.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think going almost back to question one there, isn't it? It's understanding your business and getting that visibility of your assets, and getting those basics right, and kind of the foundational controls in place before you move into the more complex kind of side of things. We do have one question in the questions. So we've been asked, how do you see the upcoming cyber resilience bill changing the landscape? So, I guess we haven't got Europe's got NIS2 coming through, and I guess this will be our equivalent. But Ali, yes, would you like to comment?
I did see the question, and I have been thinking about the answer because it's not an easy one.
We don't quite know what it looks like yet, do we?
No, we don't quite know what it looks like, but I think I'll just talk generally about the role of regulation and how much it impacts the changing landscape. So, I believe this bill is impacting critical national infrastructure and digital first. So obviously you've got are you in scope or outer scope? I think fundamentally, though, for those businesses that are critical national infrastructure, regulation will accelerate the pace of change, because there will be short-term compliance angles which need to be done. When there's regulation, that puts resources onto it, and then you're driving towards a compliant state, which naturally accelerates things. I would say that then, for me, then goes down into the supply chain. So whoever those big companies are, those CNI companies, whatever they needed to comply with, that then is going to cascade down through your supply chain, and you're going to see change come down in terms of the contracts that they have with other people to meet the obligations under that bill. So I think that's just how I think about any regulation in general, is what will it do in terms of timelines? What does it do in terms of that supply chain impact? I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's really useful, and we definitely see that kind of movement off the back of regulation, and it does give a driver into businesses. We often look at, is there digital change? There's increasing threat. There's regulatory pressure increasing as well, and I think the UK has to adopt something around cyber resilience. So I think it's a really encouraging piece of legislation that should be coming through in the near future. I think so. One final question to the three of you, I think, would be interesting in terms of vulnerability management in OT versus IT. Is it fundamentally different, or do the same principles apply to your point? Phil, can you talk to that?
I would say yes, it is fundamentally different. There are things that should be considered the same way. The perimeter itself is the crown jewels around these things. So any firewalls, anything that's being used to segment IT from OT, we should be putting all of the focus there, to start with, regardless of any other kind of visibility that you might have. If you just assume everything within that OT bubble is highly vulnerable, you need to maintain the outer of that bubble. And so all of the threat actors that we track, from state actors to criminals, are all exploiting known, often very new, but known vulnerabilities. There's no secret day zeros being, you're being exploited here. These are vulnerabilities that are published and then exploited very quickly afterwards. Their skill is exploiting the newness of a vulnerability and trying to beat that patch management process. But diving in and trying to fix a cross-site scripting vulnerability on the web interface of a PLC is pointless. Nobody is exploiting those things. And we've got to look at the fact that even some of the protocols are so vulnerable within the space that you could have a fully patched device and still send it an unauthenticated command and it create the same operational impact. So it's all about understanding how the system works, keeping it safe, recognizing that actually there are some fundamental vulnerabilities, and that often the protection is not at the device level, it's at the network level, and put the efforts there. IT is now about endpoint and being agnostic to the network. OT is still all about the network with very complex endpoints.
Yeah. And Ali, do you treat them differently, or is it the same principles?
Same principles. So I think at the fundamental level, and knowing what the new CVEs are that are coming in is the same process either side. But I completely agree with Phil that how you then treat that and the business decisions of what you're going to patch and what you're not are completely different. So I'm not going to take up more time because I completely agree with Phil.
Great. Flores, have you got any comments on that one?
Well, maybe just a couple things. So I'm not entirely sure if the network is completely unimportant in IT. I think there's still a role for monitoring the network in IT as well as in the DMZ between IT and OT. So it would be really important to see that attack path, that potential attack path. More to your question on vulnerabilities. Of course, there is in OT a greater issue with actually being able to patch. Some legacy systems probably won't support it because they're interconnected with stuff that can't change. So there's a greater hesitance around patching, I would say, or there are more issues in place for that calls a reason why you can't patch. So then it becomes even more important that you have your hygiene right, that you have your segmentation right, and that you potentially have monitoring in there as well. And should it ever happen that a CVE gets exploited that wasn't publicly, that wasn't a CVE yet, but was a 0-day or something that wasn't out in the public, it would also be really important to have some sort of incident response capability or a threat hunting capability in place too. So you can maybe look at previously collected PCAPs over a given time and do a bit of threat hunting on that to check if there has been any pre-positioning done, for example.
Great. Okay, look, well, I think we've come to the end of our time. We've got some resources here. Please do go and download those and have a look at them. It's also worth mentioning that Dragos have released their, I'm going to call it year in review, Phil, but I think it's called something else this year, but it's a really good resource for people working in OT looking at the vulnerability landscape. I'd highly recommend it. So at that point, I'd just like to thank all the panelists. Thanks for your time and joining. We could have talked for much longer, I'm sure. That's the final one in the series, and there's a few takeaways for the audience today in terms of how you continuously improve and go through that optimization of your control environment. But thanks to the panel and thanks to the audience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.